Canada's military needs to do more to combat racism and systemic discrimination. That message comes from Defence Minister Anita Anand as she released a report on the issue today. Now, that report follows a review of the Canadian Forces launched in 2020 amid concerns of links to hate groups, right-wing extremism and white supremacy. The report also included a list of recommendations that Anand says should be implemented with urgency. So let's now dig into this a bit more. Timothy Choi studies at the University of Calgary Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies. He's on the editorial board of the Canadian Naval Review and is also a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So now you're still reading the report because it's more than 120 pages and was released this morning, or at least we heard the announcement from the Defence Minister. But you have taken a look over the summary, and I'm sure you heard what Anita Anand had to say. What's your reaction to the findings so far?
I think a lot of it is somewhat expected, right? We know that there's been a problem in this regard of discrimination and racism in the armed forces, not just in terms of, what's happening within it, but how do we actually recruit and retain people to join the forces? Because obviously there's a big strategic imperative that we actually have people in the armed forces so they can, carry out the duties that's necessary for a military. As the crisis in Ukraine has shown us, there is a dire need for a strong and robust military capability in this country. And we're currently undergoing a massive modernization across all aspects of the armed forces. And those will require more and more people over the coming years to help crew and maintain all those systems and resources. And so, one of the report notes, and I do appreciate this, how, a major part of the, Canada's population will increase over the next, decade or two because of, thanks to immigration. And so, having a armed forces and D&D, the civilian side of it, that's actually welcoming to Canadians from all backgrounds is absolutely vital for the security and safety of this country.
What do you make of the fact that, it says, based on this report, that there have really been 2 decades that have gone by where things have not been addressed, where there have been links to extremist groups, and it hasn't been addressed, it hasn't been dealt with?
Yeah, I think a part of this is just that, on one hand, yes, some of it takes time, but on the other hand, has been a very strong reluctance to see it as a major core issue. Fundamentally, I think what they're looking at is, well, do these extremist members, how many of them are there within the total numbers of the CAF? And 2, do they actually impact the operations and the efficacy of, what the military has to do? And so they look at it from that very instrumental perspective of, does this actually have a negative downside to their day-to-day operations, and they don't really see it as a sort of a more broader cultural aspect of influencing in little subtle ways about how does it affect other members of the CAF and whether they feel that they are welcome and that feel that they can contribute to the safety and security of this country. And so there is that that very cold rationality that I think comes with a in some forms of military service that sees it, are you able to do the mission that's required of you in a combat zone? And then, that's where it ends, as opposed to whether you feel comfortable being in the particular service and then are therefore able to carry out your duties to the utmost of your ability.
This report is talking about systemic racism and discrimination and it carrying on for a number of years. How difficult or how challenging might it be to really turn this ship around?
I think one of the main issues that I see with this report and many other various efforts in addressing racism and discrimination in the armed forces is that they tend to look at the armed forces as a siloed institution. It's an organization that exists in itself, and that all problems or most of the problems can be solved by strictly measures that are taken within the CAF or D&D. And what I'm not really seeing is, is the broader connection with Canadian society overall. Because it's not just about what, in terms of recruitment anyway, it's not about just, what makes the D&D or CAF a attractive option for people, but how do you get people to consider the military at all as a viable career option? It's about how Canadian society sees the role of the military and defense. You ask most Canadians, about the military, or their future career options, and I honestly don't think many of them care or even think about whether that career environment is welcoming to them or not. The most important thing to them, that at least when they're 18 or something, considering a new job, is whether that job itself, the duties required of them, is appealing or acceptable to them. And so I think there is that very large gap there that ignores how different segments of Canadian society, how they see military service as a option for them in their own particular cultural understandings.
And you're talking there about the challenges with recruitment and again, sort of changing the perception that exists and the reality that exists within the Canadian Armed Forces. And there was a list of recommendations, for example, that came out falling within 13 categories, but some of those recommendations includes the need for better recruitment in multicultural communities, offering safe places for nursing mothers, and sacred spaces for people of all faiths. Those were just some of the recommendations that came out from that report. What sort of a difference will those recommendations make if they are in fact implemented?
So I do like seeing that, the recommendation to appeal more to multicultural, demographics, and that's huge. It's not just strictly within D&D and CAF too. I'm an academic. I work in the security and defense field more broadly, but we see that here as well. How many minorities work in the sciences, the tech fields versus the arts and social sciences. I look around at all my colleagues, all my academic and professional colleagues, the vast majority of them are Caucasian. So it's not just a D&D CAF thing, it's not just the attractiveness or repulsion of an organization, but a given topic area. And to address that, that factor, you really do need to go out and make yourself more aware or more noticeable within certain groups and certain demographics are not traditionally areas that see themselves as a source of people for this particular field in defense and security studies.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts today on the report that was released. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Timothy Choi of the University of Calgary Centre for Military Security and Strategic Studies.